Today, I'm very excited to bring you Dr. Roger Seheult, who is quadruple board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, as well as sleep medicine. Doc, I had a question. How does light penetrate through the body, actually get into our cells, and then what does it actually do inside our cells?
There's a great paper that was just published by Glenn Jeffrey and Robert Fosbury out of the University College London. And what they published in Nature Scientific Reports is an amazing study that really answers the question that you've just asked. Because what they did was they took subjects outside in the midday sun in London, and they were able to actually demonstrate sunlight coming into our body. They were able to measure it on one side of the body, and they were actually able, believe it or not, to measure it on the other side of the body. Obviously, much less,
Wow.
but they were able to actually see the wavelengths that the body was, let's put it this way, had windows to allow those wavelengths to go through. So let's just step back a little bit. The sun obviously gives off multiple wavelengths in the ultraviolet, into the visible spectrum, and then all the way down into the infrared. And we know this is a normal physical attribute of light, is that light that has longer wavelengths is able to penetrate through the human body much more easily than shorter wavelengths or visible light. So that's important to understand, because when you have long wavelengths that not only are able to penetrate through your clothes, but what Glenn Jeffrey's group was able to show was that it was able to penetrate through the entire body and out the other side, obviously being absorbed along the way. So this is really important, because prior to that, we had studies that showed that maybe it went a few millimeters, maybe a few centimeters, maybe 8 centimeters. So then the next step that he did was he was able to look at that distribution of the light that was coming through, and he found the wavelength that was the wavelength that the body was most transparent to or translucent to, and that was 850 nanometers. Now, this is outside of our visible spectrum. It's in the infrared light. If you were to see this light, you wouldn't see it at all. Actually, it's invisible. But what he did next was he took these subjects inside, and he set up these LED panels that transmitted at just that exact wavelength, 850 nanometers. And what he was able to show was, in a randomized placebo-controlled fashion, which is obviously one of the highest levels of evidence, that when light went into the human body, he was able to show that that light actually had an effect on the mitochondria in the retina of the cell. Now, why he chose that area is because he has the tools to measure that. He's a professor in the Department of Ophthalmology. He was able to measure by looking at color blindness in the cones of the eye. Now, here's the interesting part about that study. What it showed was that when he covered their heads so that no light could get to that part of the eye, and did the same experiment, he found, regardless of whether the light was hitting the eyes or not, there was an improvement in the mitochondria of the eyes such that the color blindness threshold was dramatically reduced. And he was able to show this, in other words, that whether light was hitting that part of the body or not, so long as there was light actually getting to the body, he was able to measure an improvement in the mitochondrial function in the retina such that these subjects had improvements in their visual perception of color. Now, there was a control group where he just actually had them stand in the same place but didn't turn on the LED lights. They had no improvements whatsoever. And so there were areas that were affected beyond the path of the light going through that part of the body. This is known as the abscopal effect. It's well known. We've seen that mitochondria in different parts of the body can actually communicate with each other and actually upregulate, even though they're not the ones that are exposed to the light.
So in other words, you're shining the light in a certain part of the body, but it's actually somehow communicating to another part of the body.
They've seen actually free floating mitochondria in the blood, so that this actually gets to different parts of the body. We're not exactly sure how that works. We're just finding out that there are ways that mitochondria can communicate within the same organ and actually in distal organs as well.
Because in the red blood cell, you don't have mitochondria, right? So
Absolutely.
So it's going through the plasma or something.
Correct. Now, your question, I think there's a part of your question that asks, well, okay, what is this light actually doing?
Yeah.
There's a number of theories behind that. For those who really want to get, nerd out on this, one of the things that the mitochondria do is they convert these reducing electrons into ATP, which is the currency of energy. And the way they do that is something called the electron transport chain. Think about the Colorado River, and you've got multiple dams along that Colorado River. And what's happening is as you have this water that's really high in elevation, as it goes through the dam and it comes out through the bottom, you have these hydro turbines that it's turning, and that's generating electricity. And then it goes down to another level, and then there's another dam where that happens, until finally you go into the Gulf of California, where the water has no more elevation above sea level, and it's essentially water with no more ability to turn turbines. That's essentially the same thing with the electrons. Electrons are transported at the very high levels, and as these electrons start to fall down the waterfall, if you will, down to the very final electron acceptor, which is oxygen, the energy that's extracted from these electrons generate ATP. It's a highly technical thing, but here's where we get to the point. The thought process is that infrared light is either making that process more efficient, it's either causing the water to be more structured in a way that the turbines can move with less viscosity, or a number of things that are actually happening at that wavelength that's causing the efficiency of the mitochondria to improve. The body has ways of neutralizing these molecules, which cause oxidative stress. And what we're finding out, very interestingly, and you've talked about this before on your show, is that melatonin is actually produced there in the mitochondria that is produced, that we are aware of, in the pineal gland that we have for sleep. So melatonin is actually even more powerful than glutathione when it comes to oxidative stress. And so here we have a built-in system in our mitochondria that is called melatonin. Think of it as the cooling system of the engine, and it mops up these oxidative stress molecules. Well, melatonin may be actually having an effect itself, making the mitochondria more efficient as well. And there's a paper that came out about 5 or 6 years ago, Scott Zimmerman, Russell Ryder, published in Melatonin Research, that proposes, based on the evidence that we've seen, that this very same infrared light that we're just talking about now can actually stimulate the mitochondria to produce more melatonin in that type of a situation. That's mind-blowing, given the research that we just talked about, saying that this very same infrared light can really penetrate through the body and hit all of those areas of mitochondria. I can't tell you how many anecdotal stories I've heard of people who are now starting to go out and do this sort of thing. People that have been bedbound, and I'm hearing them, they're getting them outside into the sunlight. They're now, it's almost like they've had a new lease on life. You know, I tremble to think about all of the nursing home patients in this country that barely make it down for dinner once a day to see everybody else, and they're in their rooms, and they have what we call dark days and bright nights. They're there, it's dark during the day, they're not getting outside, and they turn on the TV to watch what's going on, and they're not getting the darkness that they need at night. And what we really need, you know, as human beings, I see this often, you know, nutrition is good for us, but so is fasting. You know, light is good for us, but so is darkness. And it's the timing. Timing is everything.
As far as infrared, people always think, oh, I need to go buy an infrared light, but the sun gives off what percentage of infrared?
As the sun is coming up, you are going to get a certain amount of infrared light. But as the sun goes higher and higher, you're going to get more and more of that infrared light because it's able to penetrate through the atmosphere better. Infrared light really isn't affected too much by the atmosphere, though. So you can still get plenty of infrared light even when the sun is pretty low in the sky. Now, that's very different than ultraviolet light. Now, ultraviolet light, as you know, specifically ultraviolet B light, is responsible for making vitamin D in your skin. That one, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that one does require the sun to be pretty much overhead, because whereas infrared light is not very affected by the thickness of the atmosphere, ultraviolet light is. And so you will see when the sun is rising, there's almost no ultraviolet light coming through at that period of time. You've got to wait for the sun to be much higher overhead to get enough ultraviolet light and get that vitamin D. I have to think that those ratios, if we were to study those, are probably that way for a very good reason. And so if we're doing red light therapy, you know, as a critical care physician, I understand that people can't get outside, or it's too dangerous for them to get outside, or they're immobile. And so these devices can actually fill a role. I just don't want people to think that you've got to spend a lot of money to get a lot of red light devices, when I would love really to see people just actually getting outside in the sun. So if you're looking for the most amount of infrared light and you don't care about getting ultraviolet light, then when the sun is highest in the sky, you're going to be getting plenty of infrared light. Dr. Berg, there's one other thing that I'm going to mention. Green trees, green leaves, and grass is exquisitely reflective of infrared light, almost reflects almost 90% of it back to you. And you may notice this. Infrared light is the type of light that heats up objects. If you go out on a very bright sunny day and you see a leaf that is sitting there in the sun and you feel the leaf, it's cool to the touch. It's not hot. And again, it's reflecting a lot of that light. So one of the things that you can do that can really maximize the amount of infrared light that you're getting is to go outside and be in settings that are green spaces.
Wow.
In fact, we've known for a long time that people who live in green spaces have much less of the types of diseases that we see when the mitochondria are not working: diabetes, hypertension. In fact, it reduces all-cause mortality. There's some interesting studies behind that as well. But these are the aspects of infrared light that I think people don't really understand, and it's really quite beneficial.
It's fascinating because everyone can go to a park. You know, I bought one of those devices that you can measure the spectrum of different spectrum, different colors, different wavelengths of light. It's a little device. And I took it and I'm looking at my greenhouse, at the growing lights. And then I walk into the woods where it's literally dark, but the sun's up there. And it's basically infrared. It's all infrared. I was like, wow, it's just going right through the canopy. And I'm like, because I'm trying to figure out, why do the fern plants down here actually grow in the dark? Don't they need sunlight? Apparently, they can survive on a different frequency. That was very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I got to tell you a really fascinating study. You'll love this study. So this was a study that's called the Green Heart Study. It was conducted in South Louisville, Kentucky. This is an urban sprawl, 4 square miles, South Louisville, Kentucky, nothing but concrete buildings and roads. And they went around, they measured about 745 people's HSCRP. HSCRP is a blood test, and it correlates with how much stroke or heart attacks you might get. So they did that, and then they did something amazing. Over the next 2 to 3 years, they picked up a shovel and dug literally 8,000 holes in the ground and planted 8,000 mature trees with leaves growing on it. Now, this is an important study to do because for many years, critics said that the reason why people in green spaces did better was because the people that tend to live in green spaces have more money, they're more upwardly mobile. So, Green Heart Study measured everybody that were living there already in this downtown area, planted 8,000 trees in 4 square miles. Okay, that's pretty packed. Yeah. And then after 2 to 3 years, went around and measured everybody's HSCRP again. There was a 13 to 20% average drop in everybody's HSCRP. Wow. And they did not do an exercise program. They did not provide them basic income. They did not do any cooking classes. That was it. By the way, a 13 to 20% reduction in HSCRP correlates into about a 10 to 15% reduction in strokes and heart attacks.
Wow, that is fascinating. How is getting exposure to light during the day going to help us go to sleep at night?
And the reason why it's going to do that is because of 2 hormones that are the antithesis of each other. One is cortisol and one is melatonin. What melatonin is for sleep, cortisol is for wakefulness. And what really is beneficial about cortisol is having a very high signal at the very beginning of the day that tells the circadian rhythm, that tells the body, hey, let's get up, let's get ready for the daytime, it's time to get going. And then what that does is it really makes the timing of the circadian rhythm so essential that you get a much better melatonin at the end of the day. If you don't get that bright spike of light at the beginning of the day and that nice spike of cortisol, it's going to be this little wimpy thing because nothing happened. And then the body's going to be making up for that cortisol for the rest of the day, such that when you get to the end of the day and you want to have this nice melatonin spike to get you to bed, you're going to be competing against the still secretion of cortisol toward the end of the day. And this chronic elevated cortisol levels are not good for the body.
And then at night, when we want to go to sleep, so let's say a few hours before we go to sleep, what should we do with that?
The suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the clockmaker, the master clock in your brain, is saying, okay, it's that time of day where it should be nighttime. We should not be seeing any light now because it is now nighttime. And it's looking around to see and making sure that there is no light. If it sees light, it's going to say, wait a minute, I jumped the gun. It's not nighttime. It must still be daytime. Shut down melatonin, guys. We don't need it. Mm-hmm. And we're still in daytime. In fact, let me delay the circadian rhythm so that instead of coming on at 9 or 10 or 11, it comes on at 12, 1, or 2. And that's a problem, because if you constantly are exposing your eyes to bright light at night, you're going to get a delay of the circadian rhythm. You're not going to get the melatonin, which we've already discussed on here is a powerful antioxidant. And you're going to have issues with sleeping at night. So you're going to want to go to sleep one of those nights at 10 or 11, and you're not going to be able to because your clock has been set for so long at that period of time. If you think you can get away with this by doing red light, it's not as good as no light. Even in your bedroom. So if you want to sleep with patches over your eyes, if you've got appliances like clock radios that light up very brightly, or you've got all sorts of devices like VCRs or TVs that have LEDs, my advice is get those things out of your bedroom. And if you can't do that, put black tape over those areas that are giving off light.
Interesting. What about the blue blockers?
Yeah, so the blue blockers are ways of blocking that particular wavelength that your retina is most sensitive to at night. So that's better than doing nothing, but not as good as turning off the light. Now, blue blockers during the day, especially in the morning, is probably one of the worst things that you can do. Let me just tell you a little study too. One of them was looking at this hypothesis of melatonin. Like, we don't want to shut down melatonin. Well, there are people who are blind because they have severed the optic nerve, and that's the fibers that carry the light back to shut down the pineal gland, which we don't want to have at night. What they found is that people who are blind because of that actually had 30% less cancer rates. And they believe it may be related to the fact that because the pineal gland was able to secrete every single night the full amount of melatonin that it should be without being shut down, they had the benefit of having all of that. So the question could be, if this is truly the case, what would be the benefit of really practicing shutting down light at night? If this is true, we could reduce cancer rates by 30% just by doing that. Now, it even gets even more apparent, and this is a study, this was published in the Proceeds of the National Academy of Sciences, 88,000 strong study. And check this out. This is what they did. They gave everybody a watch with a light sensor, and they followed them for years, and then they measured who died and who didn't. So the way that they actually measured this out was looking at the time of day. 4 o'clock, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they asked this question. Of the people that had not greater than 90% of the light coming into their watch, how likely were they to die compared to those that had less than 50% of the light coming into their watch? Mm-hmm. And so you could do this at every single hour of the day. And what they found was that literally from 4 o'clock up until about 10 or 11 p.m., those that had the most amount of light coming into their watch actually died less. Once you hit about midnight to about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, people that had greater than 90% of the light coming into their watch versus those that had less than 50% had a higher chance of dying.
Tell us about the risk factor just for cancer in relationship to shift workers. Is there some data on that?
Generally speaking, if you talk to most shift workers, they do not carry that change in their circadian rhythm into the days that they're not working.
Right.
What they really should be doing, if you are really a shift worker and you're going to stay that way, you should continue to be a shift worker even on the days that you're off.
Yep.
Because you really want to be like you're living on the other side of the planet. And that means sleeping during the day with curtains completely sealed off, a black room that you're in, and getting up in the middle of the night and doing the same sort of stuff even though you're not working. Now, most people are not that way. And so as a result of that, your circadian rhythm is still the same as anybody else. It's just that you're working at night. What's really fascinating about this is that not only are there cancer issues with doing night shift work because of the shutdown of melatonin, and we just talked about what happened in those people who are blind, but there's also metabolic effects. And people who lose out on slow wave sleep tend to eat higher calorie and more carbohydrates. And people who eat more carbohydrates and high calories, that tends to affect their sleep. I'm a night shift worker, so I work in the ICU at night, and I realize this. And the people that I work with are there, bless their hearts. Yes, they're getting paid more to be there. And so this has really been a quest for me, is to figure out how we can do night shift work more safely. And I came across a really interesting study. They took these two groups of people, both have been doing night shift work, and they did a very simple intervention. They said to one group, okay, you basically do whatever you want, eat whenever you want, and they ate all throughout the day. Sometimes they ate at night, sometimes they ate during the day, they snacked at night. And to the intervention group, they said, no, you're going to sleep during the day like you normally would and work at night, but you're only allowed to eat during the day. But they would never eat on their night shift when they were actually working. The results showed that they were able to reduce by 80 to 90% the perturbations in metabolic problems when they simply followed the rule of, if you're doing night shift work, don't eat during your night shift work. And the reason for this, they believe, the scientists who published this paper, is that your central circadian rhythm is on a particular clock, but you have peripheral clocks, and particularly in your GI tract, right? You eat food, and that's a huge stimulus to your GI tract, probably even more than light is. And that sets off something in your organs, your digestive organs, that's something that you would normally only see during the day. So now what's happened is that your clocks are out of sync. Wow. And they believe that out of sync is one of the major engines for metabolic problems, diabetes, hypertension in workers who do night shift work.
I wanted to talk about the type of lights in someone's house, because I know with me, I have all this. I have track lighting. I'm going to get rid of it, or I'm going to convert it to incandescent. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. Now, let me give you a little bit about the history of why we're in this situation. So it was in 2007 that Congress passed a law that wanted to create standards for something called general service lamps. General service lamps are the types of lamps that you go down to Home Depot or Lowe's or buy on Amazon and you screw into your ceiling. This law passed in 2007. It got sort of pushed into the Department of Energy. And recently, they finally came down with this rule in about, I think it was 2022, after much debate. And they made this 45 lumens per watt rule. The reason is for this. When you put energy into an incandescent bulb or a halogen bulb, a lot of that energy is going into making light that you cannot see. And a lot of the engineers that looking at this saw this as simply just wasteful energy. And so they devised a light that would make you have only the energy going into making visible light, which is only a small amount of the light that an incandescent bulb makes. A lot of it is invisible light, which is in the infrared spectrum.
Wow.
So this is a way of making basically lighting more energy efficient. So this is what's happening to our environment. You can't get houses built without low E glass. You can't get houses built without LED bulbs. Here's the way around that. Get outside. There was a number of studies that showed that people that had ailments that were related to sunlight, that we were able to turn around the mitochondria in about 15 minutes. There was a study out of Brazil. They showed that infrared light, 940 nanometer, once a day for 15 minutes, showed a dramatic statistical significant difference between those two patient groups.
So what about you're in your house and there's glass? There is glass you can buy that doesn't filter out infrared?
Certainly, that's the old-fashioned type of glass. You might see this, for instance, in a greenhouse. It's usually very thin. They're trying to reduce the amount of electricity that you're going to have to consume to try to cool your house down. Here we are living in the 21st century. We're living inside 93% of the time. We go to our garage, we go to our car, we drive to our underground garage, we go to our office where we stay and work late until the sun goes down. Then we go home, we turn on TV, we socialize with our families, have late meals, and we're not being exposed to any sunlight. And literally, we can do this for weeks or months on end without actually seeing the sun.
You just gave us so much amazing data. This has been incredible. Thank you so much for being on here and taking the time to give us this great data. And I can tell that you've bent the physical universe to be able to study all this stuff. And I could imagine you've dove in deep dives way into this, like hardcore. obvious.
I had to. It was just so incredible. The more and more I studied and realized that we've really missed a huge, like you said, I mean, timing is the new nutrient, and we're not getting it at the right time. We're getting the wrong type of light at the right time. And I'll just finish with this. I think there's a big debate in this country about what is good food and what is processed food. And I think people are starting to wake up and understanding that there's good light and there's also processed light. And that makes a difference.
I like that. Thank you so much. I hope you really enjoyed this video on the importance of light. But there's one more topic related to the sun that involves vitamin D. And to really wrap your wits around this topic, I created the most amazing video on this, and I put it up right here. Check it out right now.